So first, I would like to thank the organizers for including my paper in this fantastic conference. And I would like to thank Bernie for giving a fantastic introduction to my paper. So as he said, in emerging markets, usually we have two sets of papers. Ones that look at a natural experiment in one country. And then we have other papers that look at cross-country analysis. I do both. So hopefully you will like it, Bernie. If you do, say it publicly. If you don't, say that you like it publicly and to the editors and talk to me in private, okay? So thank you. So in this paper, I study how firms do business in emerging markets. So a potential question is, why should we care about emerging markets? So these markets are becoming more and more relevant for firms and investors. They do not only account for more than 50% of global GDP, but they also drive more than 70% of its growth. In addition, since these markets are usually less mature, profitability is higher than in developed markets. However, doing business in these markets is really hard. And I know about this. This is what my home country, Argentina, ranks in an index that basically measures how institutions and regulations facilitate or impede business. So to the left, we have countries where institutions and regulations make it easy to do business, countries such as Hong Kong and New Zealand. And to the right, we have countries where regulations make it really hard to do business, countries such as Argentina and Venezuela. So this was as of 2015. Now things are slightly better in Argentina. Yeah, slightly. So in addition to being hard, business conditions in these markets can be extremely unstable. This is what Argentina ranked in the year 2000. So this led me to ask the following question. What do firms do in response to business regulations that limit their operations? So to answer this question, I do three things. First, I construct a new measure of compliance with the ban on profits repatriations that took place in Argentina about 6 years ago, and that I will explain in detail in a few minutes. Second, I use a novel and confidential database to show that my measure indeed provides strong evidence that some firms decide to bypass this ban. And third, I show that the listing status of a firm affects this decision. And in particular, what I show is that private firms decide to bypass this ban, and they manage to repatriate up to 46% of their profits despite of the ban, while listed firms mostly comply. So then a natural question is whether this flexibility that private firms enjoy creates corporate value. And I find that it does. I'm going to start by showing you some striking patterns in the M&A market in Argentina consistent with large value creation. In particular, I'm going to show you that after this regulation, private firms started acquiring listed firms at an extraordinary pace because they can increase the value of a listed firm by bypassing regulations and decreasing the cost of compliance. And then, to make Bernie happy, I extend my study to a broader sample of emerging markets and regulations and find suggestive evidence that these findings can be generalized. In particular, what I find is that when a country becomes more business unfriendly, like Argentina, the percentage of transactions where private firms acquire listed ones increases by 22 percentage points. In contrast, when a market becomes more friendly or less business unfriendly, this percentage decreases by 12 percentage points. So by doing this, I make three key contributions. First, I show that private firms have more flexibility than listed ones when operating in emerging markets. Second, I show that the value that this flexibility creates is as large as to shape M&A patterns in emerging markets. And third, I show that business unfriendly regulations attract firms that defy these regulations. Okay? So testing compliance is hard by nature because, of course, when firms bypass regulations, they do their best to hide their actions. So I'm going to exploit a natural experiment in Argentina that provides me with a close to ideal setting to test compliance, a ban on profits repatriation. So before this regulation, consider a multinational firm with headquarters in the US and subsidiaries in Argentina and in Mexico. Suppose that the Argentine subsidiary was importing goods from the Mexican subsidiary and paying $10 for these goods, selling them for $15 in the Argentine market, and transferring the profits of $5 from the Argentine subsidiary to the US headquarters. By the end of 2011, several macroeconomic conditions combined in Argentina to cause a sharp decline in the level of international reserves at the Central Bank of Argentina. So to stop capital flight, the government imposed very tight capital control measures. And in particular, it banned companies from transferring profits abroad. So companies can no longer do this. Okay, so what can a firm do? Consider the same multinational firm. The Argentine subsidiary can import the exact same product, but pay $15 instead of $10 to the Mexican subsidiary, sell this good in the Argentine market for $15 just like before, and transfer the profits from the Mexican subsidiary to the US headquarters. Okay, so by overpricing imports, this company managed to bypass the regulation and repatriate the capital. But what's the problem? Higher transfer prices after this regulation are not sufficient evidence to claim that this company is exploiting this mechanism to repatriate capital, because prices could have gone up for many other reasons, such as inflation in Mexico that cannot be passed through to the customers in Argentina. Okay? In an ideal experiment, we will have a second firm, domestic firm, not related to this multinational company, importing the same product. Okay? Ideally, this company will be importing the exact same product from the same manufacturer in the same country. So now, if we see that the price for the related importer goes up, but the price for the non-related importer does not, now we can claim that this company is exploiting this mechanism. So to have a control as perfect as this one, I'm going to focus on one particular industry, the automotive aftermarket, or parts for repair or replacement. Because in this industry, we do have this setting. We have, for instance, Ford in Argentina, importing engine XYZ from Ford in Mexico, and we have an independent distributor importing the exact same engine from Ford in Mexico and selling it to end user or repair shops for replacement. Okay? So I use a novel and confidential database that gives me 850,000 transactions where engine or engine parts are imported to Argentina, and that spans 4 years, 2 years before and 2 years after this regulation. So in my empirical setting, I use a definitive setting, and I exploit 2 sources of variation to test the price paid for one specific good. The first dimension that I exploit is the timing of the transaction, whether it takes place before or after this regulation, and the second dimension is whether the importer is related or not to the exporter. In addition, I exploit the third source of variation, that is the listing status of the parent company. So in the case of Ford, Ford is a listed company in the US, so this is going to be flagged as a transaction for a listed company. So what do I find? Well, first what I find is that usually intra-firm operations have a discount. This is consistent with prior literature. This is not new. But then in the first 2 columns, I study what private firms do. And what I find is that after this regulation, the price increase for private related importers is 10% higher than for non-related importers, suggesting that these firms are exploiting this mechanism to repatriate capital. And when I study what public firms do in the last 2 columns, I find that these firms do not exploit this mechanism, and the behavior is statistically significant. So how large is this coefficient? How economically relevant this is? I do a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and I find that this 10% increase allows firms to repatriate 46% of their profits. Okay, so this is pretty large. But then, of course, you might say, okay, but listing status is correlated with many other firm characteristics. So to rule out these other drivers of these results, I run a series of robustness tests, and I find that size does not drive these results. So I focus on a subsample of listed firms that are similar in size to the private firms in my sample. These are private firms, but these are private multinational firms that are huge. These firms sell billions of dollars every year. Okay, so don't think about a mom and pop shop. These are big, large multinational firms. So I rule out concentrated ownership, visibility, tax minimization strategies, and many other drivers of potential stories. So then the natural question is whether this flexibility that private firms enjoy creates corporate value. Usually we measure corporate value by looking at the stock market capitalization of a firm. But I cannot do this for 2 reasons. First, we do not observe the stock market cap of private firms. And second, for listed firms, we do observe, but we should not expect a big shock to the stock market cap of Ford, for instance, after a regulation in Argentina, because the relative operations of Ford in Argentina are super small. So I take a different approach. If this flexibility creates value, we should see that after this regulation, private firms acquire listed ones, because again, they can increase the value of the operations of a listed firm by bypassing regulations. So I look at a database that includes all the M&A transactions where a global multinational firm sells its Argentine subsidiary. And I find striking patterns. What I find is that after this regulation, private firms started acquiring operations from global listed multinational firms at an extraordinary pace, the blue bar. And what I find is that listed firms stop acquiring operations from private firms, the gray bar. So these patterns are super consistent with my story, but they are also consistent with many other stories. Yeah, it could be a global trend towards private firms or many other explanations. So to show that these patterns do respond to my regulation, in a triple diff setting, I'm going to exploit three sources of variation. First, whether these firms are operating in industries that are highly exposed to this regulation, and I define these as industries where firms were repatriating large fractions of their profits to their home countries. I exploit the timing of the transaction, and then I exploit whether the firm is listed or not. And what I find is that listed multinational firms are much more likely to sell their Argentine operations after the regulation than their private counterparties in the same industries. Okay, so suppose that the oil and gas industry is highly exposed to this regulation. What I find is that a global oil and gas company is much more likely to sell their Argentine operations than a private firm in the same industry. So this suggests that these results do respond to this regulation. Then the last question is whether Argentina is unique, like my mother thinks, or whether these results can be generalized to emerging markets in general. So what I do is the following. If these results can be generalized, we should see that changes in the regulatory environment of a country shape M&A transactions in these countries. So to study this, I use a panel of M&A transactions in 59 emerging markets over 14 years. And basically what I test is the following. If after the market becomes more business unfriendly, like Argentina, we see the percentage of transactions where private firms acquire listed ones going up. And we see that the percentage of transactions where listed firms acquire private ones goes down, just like I saw in Argentina. And I also test the opposite. If after the market becomes more business friendly, we find the opposite. Private firms stop acquiring listed firms, and listed firms start acquiring private firms. And just to give you a summary, I found this, and the results are large in magnitude and statistically significant. Okay? So the next step is to pin down the mechanism. Why is it that private firms can bypass regulations and listed firms do not? So to test this, I do the following. I'm going to split the M&A transactions into two buckets. In the first bucket, I'm going to put M&A transactions that involve a listed firm that operates in an emerging market, but is listed in a market with strict auditing and enforcement standards. And in the second bucket, I'm going to put M&A transactions that involve a listed firm that operates in an emerging market, but is listed in a market with more lenient standards, such as Argentina or Brazil. And what I find is that all my results are concentrated in the first bucket, suggesting that monitoring plays a key role driving compliance and the value that private firms create. Okay? So to summarize, with this paper, I make three key contributions. First, I show that private firms have more flexibility when dealing with regulations in emerging markets. And in my setting, they are able to mitigate the effect of a regulation by up to 46%. I show that the value that this flexibility creates is as large as to shape M&A transactions. When a country becomes more business unfriendly, the percentage of transactions where private firms acquire listed ones goes up by 22 percentage points. And when a country becomes more business friendly, this percentage decreases by 12 percentage points. And last, what I show is that business unfriendly regulations attract firms that defy these regulations. Okay, firms with more opaque corporate structures. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for the chance to discuss this paper. So first off, I'm a big believer that you should do corporate governance research in a global context. So I'm very, very much a believer of having papers like this one. As Pablo mentioned, a lot of business is conducted in emerging markets or recently emerged markets. Whether Korea is emerging, I'm not sure. But there are definitely costs to doing business in those settings for multinational companies, MNCs there. First, you can never get your money back. Okay, that's the risk that this paper focuses on. You can be discriminated based on not being locally incorporated or locally based. You can be, some contracts could be breached. You could be expropriated. You could be nationalized. Or the whole country could collapse on you as you do the business. So Argentina sort of qualifies in that setting. I apologize, Pablo, but it does. And this is just slicing one of those dimensions, right? So we're just going to focus on the first one there, right? So we're just going to focus on that. But even there, right, the last time we were talking right before, the last time I was supposed to go to Argentina, this was long back, Corralito happened. Corralito was 2001, but I guess I missed, so many other things before that, like Rodrigo, I don't know. So there's just so many episodes like that in the history of convertibility, unconvertibility of the Argentinian pesos. This paper is actually a minuscule episode in that series by someone that was like the second version of Kirchner, so his wife. And it's got a name of which is called cepo cambiario, meaning the exchange clamp. And it's a very significant one, but it's one in many of those episodes. So for example, if you were like myself flying down there, not in this year, but say in 2011, 2012, after this event, American Airlines was not allowing you to book with Mexican pesos, for example. They stopped doing that. And this does happen if you fly to places like, many countries around the world where you have to book with US dollars. Argentina is actually in the news right now, once again. So there'll be other papers following up this one. But it's also, as I said, many dimensions Argentina qualifies here. For example, around this time, with this administration, BlackBerries actually had to be manufactured in Tierra del Fuego, in the south, in Patagonia. Imagine that, right? Because the government was forcing actually products to be made locally, and that was there was some incentive for the penguins, were the people from the very south. Penguins are associated with the Kirchners. In case you're interested, why the penguin is in that picture. But also contracts were being breached, and national things were being renationalized by the same administration. So in I think this is 2011 or so, they were renationalizing an oil company that had originally been privatized but was coming back. And Argentina has a world record for how many times you sort of default in this recorded history. I'm sure going back more in ancient times, there might be others, but I think you're doing really well. So it's a great natural laboratory for research, and I'm not sure how the next slide will really hit this audience, but I mean, they've been in the news for this, and so in the next few weeks, there might be a redeeming event in the World Cup, but it's really, it is really. Now, however, it's not unique in another setting. So this multinational companies are so constrained to do business in certain countries that, for example, in India, a number of them are listed. They have their listed subsidiaries because before deregulation, they had actually to have that. That's also true in Turkey and for the other countries in the previous paper that we saw. So for example, this is just the 15 that are in the Nifty. Nifty is the main stock index in India. The Nifty 50, there's 15 of them that are MNCs. So Unilever has a listing there. I don't know if you guys can read that, but Unilever, Bosch, Suzuki, etc., Siemens, they all have like local listings. And this is very much an issue of how do you repatriate the profits. It's a very controversial issue in India as well, Do you do that through royalties on the horizontal axis, or do you do that through dividends on the vertical axis? And you basically see firms going both directions. So I think there's issue of repatriation is a big deal, and it's a big deal and can be further examined, not just in Argentina context. Right, so let's focus on the actual papers. So first, I felt like there are two papers, and I'm sure Pablo gets this comment all the time, but it's just there's a lot going on. So the first paper is as Pablo mentioned, a natural experiment that's very clean, but the first question is, why does Pablo have the data, right? So, and I asked him this, sorry I'm being recorded right now, but, but right, so the first question is, why do we even have the data? Can the firms be listed, meaning the names of those firms be provided, or can they not, right? So number two is, why then did he focus on automotive parts, so auto parts? Because, I mean, there are very many other sectors would have been affected around that. And so I myself had no clue what 84.07 is, harmonized. So this is from tariffs schedules. So I Googled myself, got to visualize what that was, because I had no clue what these parts were. But so to me, that was kind of important. And then the second part is then he mapped to get the brands, to get the, so large, very large project here, but at the same time very narrow in one very small setting. He probably did not show you the pictures, but they speak for themselves, right? So the question about let me be careful here. I don't want to say data mine, but this is very clear in the data. This is one sector where you definitely see this pattern. So before the El Cepo, before this event, there was the private firms used to be importing cheaper, but then they all of a sudden they start importing higher than the other one. So there was something unusual there. It's quite visual. I mean, you can see it immediately there. That doesn't seem to happen for the other multinationals that are public. So this is indicative of the main results that then, it's a very nice setting. It's very clear. But going in as a researcher, why did I focus on this specific industry? What made me, I mean, I knew other firms were targeted. Unilever was targeted in Argentina, I believe. American Airlines was targeted. I mean, so there are many other examples there, so I wasn't sure going in. But once you do that, you kind of pass that hurdle, then I think the results are pretty strong there in terms of the natural experiment. So what are really my suggestions? This could be a full paper if you do the following. You go two directions. One is you stay in Argentina, but then you tell us, well, why this automotive industry versus the others? So what is limiting the data acquisition for all the other industries that is not being observed? As a researcher, this might be then explore that variation, particularly if it is a commodity business versus a low margin business. Where is this flexibility available? Where is it not? And why cannot public firms circumvent this a different way? Is there an alternative mechanism that they could have used that are not shown in this paper, but what was stopping them from using another way? Or you could go from Argentina and see this bigger theme of profit repatriation, including other countries that are interesting. So then you go explore MNCs, but that are maybe using a global sample and exploring the forms that multinationals use for repatriating profits in different geographies. And then the other thing is, besides repatriation, like what other things that come up are tax strategies, like what is tax, what is the tax optimizing way? That's paper number one, and you're not done because there's another paper coming up. So the second paper is, then he looks at what is the reaction to this type of constraints So he goes and examines how therefore then a number of transactions are observed whereby entities go from public to private. And that may be a way to react to this type of problems. And it's quite clear in that diagram as well. You can see it immediately in that. But to me, that felt like a separate paper, but that's fine. And then it does, does kind of, does abide by our rules of the profession. It will have a triple difference with whatever and so forth. So it will show up nicely there. The only question I had was more, contextual, like what is this, which industries are more being subject to this regulation that are more finding it harder to repatriate profits and so forth. And so that speaks to the first paper. Why did we focus on the automotive parts and not on, very general sample? The second part of the second paper is then goes from Argentina to other EM. In this setting, this is like the opposite of the previous comment to the previous paper. Why not go to develop? The sample becomes very unbalanced. And the reason is that only countries that are in EM status tend to swing a lot between regulation and deregulation. And the other DM, the developed markets kind of stays fairly stable in that index that Pablo showed you. Like, Argentina was up there in 2000, and it's way down there now in the sample period. So there's very little variation in developed markets, and that's why they're called developed, maybe, but very little in the others. So, but it would be good to actually, talk a little bit about that before we look at the results. Tons of results there as well. So any comments I have on paper 2? Yeah, this could be another paper. Very cool one. We're having this discussion about public versus private markets. This is a cool paper. Why not just do that by itself? And then also examine other solutions to this problem, like joint ventures and other ways that people do business in tough environments, which they need to maybe identify a local partner and so forth, or different types of exits besides M&A. The other alternative is also, instead of saying entity die, is also looking at an entity being formed or being incorporated, taken to market, and so forth. So seeing both dimensions of exits as well as IPOs into the market. So that's it. But overall, and I hope I kind of incentivized everyone to go beyond, public markets. And I think Pablo should be commended for, keeping our interest high in a place like Argentina. All the best for the World Cup.
Okay, Pedro, thank you so much for the fantastic comments. We will win the World Cup, that's for sure. This time is our year. Just for the records, if you look at the long history, France defaulted more times than we did. So, okay. So why did I look at one specific industry? It's because in this industry, I do have a counterfactual. In most of the other industries, like Unilever, I will not have an independent firm in Argentina importing the same shampoo produced by Unilever. So this is why I need this particular industry. I need this counterfactual, and I don't have many of these industries. Someone suggested washing machines. I could do that. It took me a couple of months to get that data, sitting on a computer, the emerging markets way. I could try. Hopefully, no referee will ask for that. So another comment was, are the public firms doing something different? Maybe. So this is, of course, dark area, so I don't see anything that they do. I cannot see if they just take a flight with portfolios full of money. I don't see all of that, that's true. But to me, the fact that they are not exploiting this simple mechanism that is readily available is enough to say that it is costlier for them than for the private firms to do it. A potential mechanism is that if you're caught doing this and you're a private firm, you just bribe the regulator, and that's it. If you're a listed firm, you bribe the regulator, you're prosecuted in the US. Okay, so this is why, even though I don't see anything that public firms do, I think that this is enough evidence to suggest that it is costlier for them to pay bribes, say, in emerging markets. Last comment, so 2 comments I'm going to address. That is why I don't look at other countries. That's a great idea. The only issue that I have is that I don't have good data as I do have in Argentina, because in Argentina, I do have the exact product. I not only have the category of the product, many other papers only use that, I do see the exact product. So I do see the model and serial number of the engine being imported, the power, displacement. So I don't have this data for other countries. I'm trying to get that for other projects, but this is only in Argentina. So good things about Argentina, we have good data and detailed data. And for the developed markets, yeah, it's true. We don't have so many shocks in developed markets. I tested the ones that I found, and I don't find any results. Why? Because private firms in Denmark are audited strictly. So I don't find any results. I do have few shocks, but I don't find any results in developed markets. So thank you. And now open for questions. Yeah, Marco.
Question or remark about paper 2, to use the discussant's taxonomy. There, essentially, the thing that you're using is the difference or the change over time in the stringency of these regulations.
Yes.
But another source of variation that you could potentially use, maybe on top of this or together with that, would be changes in tax pressure. And I'm saying this because I have been playing with this. I have a paper with Tullio Iapelli, Fausto Panunzi, and Andrea Lul, in which we are essentially looking at the, in a panel data setting, at the impact of tax pressure on the choice of transparency by firms. And then the impact that this choice of transparency has on investment decisions. But the first one is the piece that connects with your research. And presumably these countries are changing, maybe in a correlated fashion, their tax pressure together with their bans on this or that and so on. So you could exploit that as well.
Yeah, I have not looked at this. So for this paper, what I use is shocks to the economic firm of the world index that is similar to the doing business index. When I look at individual categories, so this index is composed by 5 individual components. So one is regulations on labor, another one is on capital mobility and others. For each individual component, I don't find any results. I only find results for the aggregate. Mm-hmm. I have not looked at tax changes individually.
And there are international data on that.
Yeah, I use that to control for the first paper, because it could be that firms change transfer prices to shift profits to localities with low tax rates. Mm-hmm. So I do have that data. I could use it for the second part. That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
My question is related to the first paper. So you mentioned that the private firms in your example in the US is the large private firms. So a lot of large private firms in the US need to report like the financial statement, the 10Ks as well. So are these firms in your example? And if so, would it be possible for them to get monitored as well?
So yeah. It might be 2 papers, but it felt like 5 for all the effort that I put on it. So these are not only US firms, the private firms, these are firms in developed markets. So I do have, these are automotive firms, so I do have many in Germany, Japan, Korea. So not all of those file here in the US. The ones that do file are those that have public debt, for instance. I do not see
So you don't see them to be different from public firms?
I don't see the difference. So when I test these are both gigantic firms, but I do see a difference in their behavior.
Okay. So you mean, so you mean the differences between these large private firms with public firms?
I do see a difference between public and private firms. I cannot exploit private firms that do file 10Ks because they have public debt and those that do not, because in each country, I don't have enough observations.
Yeah. So one possibility is to look at the European countries. For example, in the UK, all private firms, like the small ones and the big ones, both of them need to report. So maybe this is one possibility.
Yeah, I can try that. I don't have enough power because I have 23 automotive firms that are private, and these are listed in many countries. So I don't have enough heterogeneity. So I don't think I will have enough power to test the differences. If I get more firms and I get the data for washing machines, I hope to do that. But yeah, I don't have enough firms to test. Yes, but thank you. Yes.
So on the issue of what are the public firms doing, I believe they are becoming exporters themselves. So BMW is a major soya exporter in Argentina. Porsche has a wine and oil, olive oil division, not motor oil, and Hyundai as well. So the question is this second best to what you're, I mean, is this what they have to do because they don't have a better option? Or it's the other way around. Maybe these firms have direct contacts with the government and they are able to export in better terms than the private firms. And is the private firms are the ones that are using the second best option, right? And maybe it's not an econometric question, it's more of a qualitative question, but it would be nice to know which one's which, because I think the interpretation of the paper relies a lot on this.
Yeah. So for those of you that are not familiar with deciding, some firms or most firms are forced to export to be able to import. Okay, because when you import, you are sending money abroad. So they were forced to export to basically bring money back. So this is why some firms bought olive oil companies. They just bought it to show that they were exporting to be able to import these parts. I don't see a change in the volumes that these companies import into Argentina. So I don't see any differences after this regulation in the volumes that BMW imports into Argentina and that some private firms import. So I can't rule out everything because, of course, this is not transparent. So I don't see if public firms are doing something different. But I don't see any differences in the volumes, at least. It's true that they bought firms to export, but private firms did as well. Yeah, thank you.
I guess I'm curious whether you've got data that would allow you to look at the, say, aggregate effects for Argentina in terms of, say, profitability of public versus private firms, or the growth of assets, or the growth in employees, to get some additional evidence that would support your hypothesis?
I wish I could. The only problem is that listed firms, so these are global multinational firms, so they do not report disaggregated data for Argentine operations, right? So I do not get to see how much they sell in Argentina. I don't get to see how many employees they hire in Argentina. So I don't have this data to understand what's going on at the firm level. I use the data on imports because this is clean, because this is the only data that allows you to send money abroad. Okay, so if I say that I import an engine and I paid it, the cost is $1,000, I can transfer $1,000. So this is clean. But then I don't have any data, so private firms do not report, and listed firms report at the aggregate level. Yeah, I wish I had. I tried with the, similar to the IRS in Argentina, but for fiscal secrecy, they were not giving me the data. I wish. Thank you.
So this builds, I think, on a question already posed, but this is about paper one and the discussant's framing. So if I understand it, you've got you've got firms, multinationals that are incorporated in lots of different OECD countries, and you're breaking them out by whether they're listed or not. But what proportion of the listed sample is in the US? Because if I'm thinking about the theory motivating this, so the theory is that if you're listed, you're subject to higher scrutiny. Another way of posing that theory would be to say, if you're in the US, you're subject to more scrutiny. So have you tried it, by using US, non-US, as opposed to listed, non-listed? And it may well be that there's quite a lot of overlap between the listed subsample and the US subsample, and so, you may have an issue identifying the two.
Yes. So I tried some things. The issue is that most of the countries where these firms come from are as stringent as the US. So Germany also is.
I just, based on my work on enforcement, I would doubt that. I mean, I would suggest that the US is an outlier in terms of stringency.
Okay, no. So I have not done US versus not US. I think out of the 23 firms, I have only 5 in the US, so I could try. But I don't know if you will buy the results. It's a good idea. I wish I had more heterogeneity in terms of where these firms are coming from. I wish I could just randomly assign some to emerging markets and some to developed markets. But at least in this industry, I don't have that. I have only 1 firm in an emerging market, and all the 22 come from OECD countries. Yeah, but it's a great suggestion. I wish I had more data on that. Thank you.